So notice how Jews have one Bible that's basically centered on the ancient Hebrew. Protestants have followed the rabbis in a sense and accepted the Hebrew Bible as being the Old Testament. Roman Catholics actually followed more what was ancient Christian tradition of accepting not only the Hebrew Bible, although it was translated into Latin and Greek most of the time, but also Jewish documents that came from that period and were surviving in Greek itself. So that's why Protestants have one set of text, Roman Catholics have another, and Jews have another. Now what about those Episcopalians, as one of my friends says, those Whiskeypalians? They decided to be in the middle. So they wanted to be somewhat Protestant and somewhat Catholic. So if you go to an Anglican church, they will also, most of the time, accept the Roman Catholic canon along with Roman Catholics, even though a lot of Episcopalians and Anglicans, a lot of them, not all of them, will consider themselves Protestant. So Anglicans follow the Roman Catholic canon a bit more. Protestants and Jews have different ones. That's kind of where we are right now. But notice how long it took us to get there, how many centuries it took. Now the big question is, who did it and why did they do it? Basically, some councils in the early church, councils would be called by the emperor, for example, by Constantine or his successors. Sometimes they would get so tired of churches, you know how Christians squabble all the time. You know, when I was a kid growing up in Texas, one of our sayings was, let's make like a Baptist church and split. So, Christians are always squabbling. So the emperors would try to call together councils to get them to agree on things, to get them to agree on doctrine, to get them to agree on the canon. So some councils did try to set the canon. And so you had some councils doing this. But generally, the canon developed over time through a process of general consensus. And then, as I said, through these different institutions of Christianity, ending up coming to somewhat different decisions. But why do they include things? Why were some texts included in the New Testament and other texts not included in the New Testament? The reason is not the one that most modern people think is the reason. Most people say, why is this text Scripture? Why is it canon? And most Christians will say, because it is inspired. That's not what the ancients believed. They believed that inspiration, there were lots of texts that were inspired, and there were different levels of inspiration. So just because a text is inspired, even if you believe it's inspired by God, and it's that God told somebody to write it, that wasn't enough for ancient Christians to include it in their Bible, in their canon. So inspiration, contrary to modern assumptions, was not the criteria you hear ancient people talk about. Apostolic authorship was one thing they talk about. So, for example, Papias and other ancient writers, they said, well, we accept the Gospel of Mark because, well, if it wasn't written by an apostle, it was written by someone very close to an apostle, and it was Peter's Gospel that Mark just published. Or Luke published Paul's Gospel. Now, and so often, some people in the ancient world, if there was a gospel they didn't like, they didn't want it to be included, they would argue against it being authored by an apostle. So that at least they claimed for some that, for these texts, that they wanted apostolic authorship or close to apostolic authorship. The problem was, we can tell historically that these texts were not written by apostles, nor do we believe they were written even by the close disciples of apostles. They're anonymous texts. So if that was the reason they were included in the ancient world, it's not the reason they're still in now, because modern scholars don't believe the apostles actually wrote all of these texts in the New Testament. Flexibly, here are the criteria. If it's not necessarily apostleship and it's not inspiration, what are the real reasons? First, it seems that the texts that at least these people believed were the most ancient and had the closest proximity to Jesus. Like I said, they wanted them to be traced back to the apostles. So even if they weren't, it's because that's what people believed about these texts. A second big reason was simply general acceptance. Apparently, the texts that were the most popular over a bigger geographical space tended to be the ones that got in. Now, it's true, there were different gospels that were popular in different parts of the Mediterranean. So, for example, the Gospel of Thomas seems to have been especially popular in certain parts of the East. And in Rome, there'd be other documents, or different parts of the Roman Empire. But generally, as time went on, it seems like Christian leaders tried to include those gospels, those documents that were more generally accepted. In fact, if you wanted to argue against, say, the letter of Hebrews being included, you could say, But all the people in the East don't accept the letter of Hebrews as part of their canon, so we shouldn't either. So general acceptance was big. But the most important criterion, this probably won't shock you, especially if you're as cynical as I am, theological acceptability. People tended to want to include the documents that matched their own theology. In other words, you believed something was apostolic if it taught stuff you believed. So, of course, documents that did teach that the Creator God was an evil, demonic God and not the Father of Jesus Christ, and there are early Christian documents that teach this, they were excluded. Why were they excluded? Well, some of them claimed to be by apostles. Nobody exactly knew how old they were. They were excluded because they taught a doctrine that other Christians thought was heretical and not accurate. So when you say, though, theological appropriateness is what ended up being the most important criterion for including stuff in the canon, you actually have to say then, appropriate to whom? And of course, that means you have a judgment call. But generally, the documents that came to be accepted were the ones that people we call the proto-orthodox. This is a term that Bart Ehrman uses in his textbook. You'll see it, and he explains what he means by this. In the 2nd century, you can't really use the term Orthodox Christianity versus heretical Christianity because there wasn't, orthodoxy hadn't been established yet. It was all in a state of flux. People believed all kinds of different things. And what this class will do is talk about how did what came Orthodox Christianity, how did it become Orthodox Christianity rather than one of the other kinds of Christianity. And we'll talk about that repeatedly. In the 2nd century, though, it's anachronistic to talk about Orthodox Christianity versus heretical Christianity. So what some scholars have done is create this word proto-Orthodox. And all they mean is those Christians who believe the kinds of stuff that would later be proclaimed as Orthodox in creeds and councils. So what happens was the people who were the Christians in the 2nd century and the 3rd century who resembled what later became Nicene Orthodox Christianity, they were the ones who had the most say eventually in what became part of the Bible. So in the end, the canon is a list of the winners in the historical debate to define Orthodox Christianity. Questions? Comments? Outbursts? Rantings and ravings? Nope? Yes, sir.
How did, you said the books are written anonymously, or we don't know exactly who wrote them. How were the names tagged on? Like,
Okay, if the books were written anonymously, how did the names that are associated with them?
How does that compare to other fields where we don't know who wrote a book, another Greek classic, but we somehow develop what we think so-and-so wrote it?
Yeah.
How does this compare?
Most of the stuff that we'll say has a wrong name attached in the New Testament is not anonymous, although there are some, it's pseudonymous. But there are some that are anonymous too. The Gospels, we say, are anonymous because they didn't come attached with a name as far as we know. How did those names get attached? By different people. Partly it was because they wanted this text to be authoritative in some way, and so they tended to attach the name of a particular apostle to them, or a particular disciple. Or in some ways, for example, the Gospel of Luke may have gotten its name Luke because in the Acts of the Apostles, which is also written by the same author, Luke is an actual character who follows Paul around. So it may have been that the name Luke in the Acts of the Apostles got connected with the Acts of the Apostles and the Gospel of Luke as its author. So sometimes it's something in the text itself that may have prompted someone to think that. Often we just don't know how it got. It just happened because somebody just said, it's authoritative, it must have been written by an apostle. We have time for one more question. I think I saw a hand up, then we need to dismiss. No more questions? Okay, see you next time. Remember, we are meeting on Friday.